Thanks so much, Taha. How many of you were able to make the wonderful rally here last night? It was so good. So Brynne and I are hoping that we can get into more detail about two main issues related to last night and taking it to today, which is why are so many workers turning to Poilievre, Ford, Trump, and others who couldn't care less about workers, and why it is crucial that we build mass militant movements to take on the bosses and the politicians before, during, and after elections. We want to show that there was and is nothing inevitable about the victory of the far right, and that actions we take collectively every day will make the difference we need. And these two questions, why do workers have these ideas and how do ideas change through struggle, are questions you can apply to any strategic issue you run into, and probably apply to all the talks here at Red October. For my part of this opening conversation with you, I want to provide some historical context in terms of material economic conditions and mass movements of the last few decades, as well as the failure of liberal and social democratic governments to meet workers' needs. Recently, I saw the title of an article in The Nation magazine that immediately resonated with me. It was called, Why do working class people vote against their interests? They don't. We want to make the case that workers don't consciously choose parties that are working against them. In fact, they vote for who they think can really serve their interests. But let's start by asking, why is it that ruling class ideas dominate? And I think I'm probably the fifth person to speak at this conference to use as Marx quote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. And then how do elections in our so-called democracies fit into these ruling class ideas? Put simply, ruling class ideas about everything, including ideas like freedom, democracy, parenting, fairness, dominate because the ruling class does a mostly, but not totally, good job of controlling how we receive, transmit, and discuss these concepts. They control both the mainstream media and social media platforms. Can you say Elon Musk? They control school curriculum. They control religious ideologies. Most importantly, they control the means of production, the how and why and what of producing all the things that people need to survive, and especially things we don't need to survive and even undermine our being, things like the military, mass advertising, and fossil fuels. They also control the context and huge limitations in which we choose how we are governed, or as they would claim, how we govern ourselves. In a recent article by John Clark for Canadian Dimension magazine, he describes how wealthy capitalists have been able to create a very limited form of democracy and how that system diverts social resistance and, of course, how we need to mobilize outside that system. We're told that the liberal democracy we have in Western societies is, while not perfect, the best on offer, and that every alternative is wrong, that even well-intentioned ideals promoted by naive intellectuals and poets are doomed to be taken over by totalitarians like Hitler, Stalin, or Mao. So it is that when we think of democracy, we tend to think of elections as they currently exist, or maybe we push for proportional representation. But we're never encouraged to consider that maybe we should be voting for who runs our workplaces and how. And the same thing for our schools, our health system, our social services. For socialists, real democracy is from below. It's built on the confidence and clarity of workers and oppressed peoples that prioritizes international and anti-racist solidarity. And we know that ruling class ideas, while dominant for sure, are not all powerful, and that people's notions change depending on their experiences both individually and collectively. Ideas do change profoundly and in fact very quickly in the course of mass protests and workplace strike actions. People see for themselves the lies that are told in the media and the real role of police in protecting the boss's property. I just want to say that in the rest of my talk, I'm going to confine my references mainly to North America and Europe because that's the data that was easiest for me to access, but to emphasize that whether capitalists or workers were profoundly impacted by events that take place outside these borders. So with that backdrop about how we conceive of elections and how they are used to manipulate our range of choices, let's look now at the material conditions of the last few decades, because it's precisely these material conditions that inform how ruling class ideas and ruling class actions must take place. We know that our social conditions stem from conditions of the economy and the resulting tension between bosses and workers. For the vast majority of the time that industrial capitalism has been in existence, it has seen repeated, virtually non-stop cycles of economic crises. The roots of these crises are twofold. The first reason has to do with overproduction. Capitalism is deliberately unplanned for the most part, and because each capitalist wants to dominate their share of the marketplace, capitalists end up producing too much that can be sold at the profit they would like. Not that there's no profit, but not a high enough profit. And that's why you'll routinely hear stories about livestock being killed or shiploads of grain being dumped into the ocean. It's not because we don't want to consume those things, but because from time to time, the capitalist owners can't get the profit margins they would like, so they just get rid of this stuff. The second reason in classic markets economics for crises is what Marx called the tendency for the rate of profit to decrease over time. Since value is derived from labor power, the work we do, when capitalists try to increase productivity by investing in machinery to replace workers, they reduce the amount of labor power and their rate of profit. That doesn't mean they aren't making profits, but the rate of profit will decline over time. Of course, there are lots of other factors that lead to economic crises, whether we're talking about war or pandemics or financialization, like we saw in the 2008 so-called mortgage crisis, where people are making money from money, not from producing goods and services. Now, you might wonder what difference do these things make, the crisis of overproduction and the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. Let's just say anytime bosses can't make the profits they want, they don't like it. And they make sure they aren't the ones who are going to pay for the crisis. Instead, they try to and often succeed in having the crisis paid for off our backs. Bosses will carry out mass layoffs, reduce hours, raise prices, cut benefits, lobby harder against labor and environmental protection. If possible, relocate their business to lower-paying countries, lobby for government messages that we all need to tighten our belts. And that means government austerity programs with massive cuts to the services we need. And that's why it's important to know that capitalism is inherently crappy, not just once in a while, and not just due to certain bosses. It is precisely because workers pay for these crises that you see so much anger and so much openness to scapegoating others. But there was an exception to these regular crises during what is called the post-war boom, that period starting after 1945, when Western economies exploded, as did the use of fossil fuels, incidentally, to increase production of cars, housing, domestic goods, and most significantly, the arms race, what British Marxist Michael Kidron referred to as the permanent arms economy. Even Republican President and General Eisenhower referred to the phenomenon as the military-industrial complex. This was the time when us boomers, and I think there's only a few of us in the room, were born, and we got used to seeing low unemployment rates, higher wages, this is all relative speaking, higher wages, expansions to post-secondary education, health, and social services. But all good things under capitalism come to an end, and by the 1970s, this boom was over, and capitalism returned to its normal self. That is, overproduction, declining rates of profit, we mean the return of recessions, inflation or stagflation, and higher unemployment levels. In other words, living standards began their long descent into the chaos we have today, particularly following the adoption of neoliberalism in the 1980s and the calls to cut government deficits so that workers, again, had to pay for the economic crises, excuse me, not the bosses or the governments that represent them. According to the sort of left-leaning Economic Policy Institute in the States, corporate tax rates in the U.S. went from over 50% in the 1950s, over 50, to less than 15 today. In Canada, according to the Finance Committee report to the House of Commons, the decline in corporate tax rates here was about the same. A 2010 report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives points out that families in this country went from paying about 33% of their income on taxes to about 45% today. So it's like this teeter-totter when you can see the proportions of the burden of taxation going increasingly from corporations into households, and I wonder whose idea that was. Within all of this, the oppression of many parts of the working class continued, but the period also saw the rise and then fall of workers' organizations, from the high point of the Teamsters rebellions of 1934 to the 1950s McCarthy period, which for all its red baiting was really about crushing worker militancy to better serve the interests of bosses. The temporary rise in employment and education levels meant that oppressed groups gained the confidence to build on past struggles and explode during the 1960s and 70s to create groundbreaking movements like civil rights and black power, red power, women's liberation, gay pride, and advocacy for the rights of disabled people. And many of these overlapped with the huge anti-war movement opposing America's invasion of Vietnam. And while in the West, for sure, we've seen magnificent periods of uprising since then, for example, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, climate activism, and more recently, unprecedented solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, we have not yet returned to the 1960s levels of mass action. Part of this has to do with the co-optation of these movements by and failures of liberal and social democratic governments. While such governments, and even conservative governments we had in Ontario for decades, before had been able to provide reforms during that post-war boom, like expanded health and education and social housing that I mentioned. But as capitalism returned to its normal state of crises, governments who refused to take on capitalism, which is the norm, were no longer able to provide such reforms. Along with this, we saw less militancy among union members, including at the rank and file level. And we saw too much cozying up between union leaders and NDP politicians, all of which was aimed at dampening workers' expectations and laying the groundwork for the rise of the right. By the 1980s, there arose the neoliberal mantra or dominant ruling class idea that government deficits and debts were the root of all evil and had to be reduced, if not eliminated. And that's when you saw the end of producing thousands of units of affordable housing, when budgets for health, education, and social services were thrown to the wolves, along with rent controls and grants for post-secondary education. While liberal and social democratic governments tried to keep using the rhetoric of reformism, we increasingly saw what's called reformism without the reforms. The continued breaking of promises to workers, to oppressed groups, accompanied by decreasing living standards, meant that over time, people had way less trust in governments and public institutions to serve their interests. These have been documented for Canada, for example, by the University of Waterloo's 2024 report, Trust in Research Undertaken in Science and Technology. It's actually beyond science and technology. And among other things stated, some signs that trust is beginning to decline may reflect worsening economic conditions for many Canadians. You think? Many surveys have consistently found that Canadians' overall trust in most institutions and public figures has been low recently and was low before the pandemic, with total rates of trust between 1/3 and 1/2 of the public being typical. This resulted in ever-decreasing turnouts at elections. People weren't apathetic, they were pissed off. They didn't see any of the parties representing them, and that's true in many, many Western countries. According to Elections Canada, voter turnout rates in this country for federal elections have gone from about 75% in the 1950s to about 65% in the last decade. Participation rates in provincial elections are even lower. For example, there was only a 43% turnout rate in the 2022 Ontario election, the lowest in the province's history. So that creates a political vacuum, right? And it speaks to the question of political organization. So in this situation, what happened was that the ruling class, fearing resistance, because they've studied history, probably better than we have, increasingly fomented divisions within the working class to deflect attention away from the real source of declining living standards, namely the economic crises built into capitalism. They turned workers' attention away from these and instead towards diversions, the easiest ones being around supposedly rising crime rates, along with the tried and true racist tropes around immigration. With the help of organized religions, women's rights also came onto the chopping block, along with those of 2S LGBTQ peoples. Some of the big funders of Trump, for example, include Elon Musk and Dan Cathy with the National Christian Foundation. These billionaires are only too happy to fund white supremacist groups, conspiracy platforms, and groups promoting the traditional nuclear family and so-called traditional roles of women. Parties like the NDP came to power in a number of provinces and repeatedly broke promises, or maybe never even made commitments in the first place, around Indigenous rights, tackling global warming through eliminating the use of fossil fuels, or providing economic safeguards to mitigate the harms caused by capitalism's inevitable crises. I'd love to know what your experience has been if you've lived under an NDP government, especially if you're here from BC, whose election's happening as we speak. It's no wonder then that conditions were and are ripe for so-called strongman politicians like Trump, or so-called populist politicians like Poilievre and Ford to attract the attention of desperate workers who see that they've been sold down the river by liberal and social democratic governments. As has been discussed a lot at this conference so far, rightly so, the most common scapegoat for both billionaires and these far-right groups they support is immigrants. European governments have effectively moved their borders to North Africa, where both mercenary forces and governments of countries in North Africa serve as border patrol against migrant entry into Europe. In our country, all conservative forces have targeted migrants as the source of housing shortages, job theft, and lack of access to public services. Governments have imposed huge barriers for people from Sudan and Palestine, countries which are internationally recognized as facing the biggest humanitarian crises on the planet. But who benefits from these divisions in the working class? All of these right-wing parties, once in power, do little or nothing to improve working conditions or human rights, if not make them worse. It is the bosses who are laughing all the way to the bank, because a divided working class can never successfully take on the capitalists. That is why our role of socialists has to be active participation in and support for all movements that take on the boss's agenda, particularly those movements that include demands related to international solidarity, like ending the arms trade to Israel, and to solidarity with oppressed groups in this country, for example, linking the struggles of Palestine and indigenous peoples here. We need to build these movements before and after elections, and during elections, we have to link movement demands with parties' campaigns to expose and oppose corporate-dominated politicians, and where appropriate, support candidates who support our demands. Now, I realize that what I've been presenting so far can be seen as completely pessimistic about our prospects, but we argue that it's precisely by having this analysis of capitalism we can understand how it works, that it will never serve our interests, and that it's not some big mystery that we can't get our heads around. In fact, this analysis helps us chart a path for working class success. Because as much as we have to fight for reforms under capitalism, and we do need to fight for reforms under capitalism, only overthrowing capitalism through a socialist revolution will we win the world we need and deserve. So now that we've looked at why the ruling class acts the way it does, and what leads many workers to support right-wing parties, it's time to look at how we overcome all this. With that, I'll turn things over to Brynne to give us some concrete examples of how the balance of forces can change through mass struggle, not just mass voting. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? That's great. Thanks, Taha. Thanks, Val. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So Val's talked about why workers support anti-worker parties from a political and economic and a bit of historical perspective. And she provided insights about why in capitalism, ruling class ideas and ideology are dominant. And because that's what's on offer, a lot of workers have those ideas too, often. But we know that changing those ideas is possible. Through activity and organizing, workers can come to their own, and sometimes their own conclusions, which are sometimes radical political conclusions. So in today's discussion, I want to invite you to think about how your own ideas and those around you have been transformed through struggle, and maybe share that in the discussion, whether it was during a strike, through being involved in a campaign, or in other organizing work. So my talk's going to start with considering why workers in our communities today are supporting right-wing politicians like Ford and Poilievre. And it's not just, as Val already said, it's not just an intellectual exercise, but I think actually a strategic question. As organizers, understanding why workers vote for anti-worker parties helps us have effective conversations that can expose the contradictions, racism, and xenophobia that right-wing politicians are putting forward. It also helps us direct the valid anger and frustration that people are feeling in a different direction. And it helps us create paths into activity in our organizations, whether that's unions or in our campaigns, to overcome those divisions within the working class and build unity. So this work is necessary for sure to build a movement to defeat Poilievre or Ford. It's also necessary to build the worker power that we need to win more transformational or revolutionary change. And of course, when I say defeat Poilievre and Ford, I don't just mean at the polls on election day, but we must be fighting the agenda and ideas they're putting forward now, during elections, and after elections. For a second, let's just pause on elections. So under capitalism, elections present some possibilities and also some limitations. So voting is a very isolating experience. We go into the voting booth by ourselves, we pick an option. Most often, a lot of the options aren't very inspiring. On the other hand, a lot of people engage with politics during an election. So where we have movements who've built broad audiences for particular issues, so say, for example, around migrant rights or public health care or paid sick days or an arms embargo, if we can advance those issues in election times, it can help isolate and expose right-wing candidates while also pushing the NDP and the whole terrain that the debate in an election is taking place in to the left. Wait, to the left. Yeah, I was like, oops. Yeah, during the 2021 federal election, Alex Kerner wrote for Spring. Alex is here, as I'm quoting you. I was like, I can't say this any better. This is how revolutionaries refuse to be bystanders during elections. They turn anger and disappointment toward Trudeau away from reactionary conclusions by pushing demands we really need and that are rooted in broad movements. So when it comes to the upcoming elections here in Ontario, we can't afford to accept defeatism or fatalism. Federally, many people are so resigned to the fact that Poilievre's going to win that you hear people say things like, when Poilievre's prime minister? No, we can't do that. Don't get me wrong, the polls don't look good. It's very possible that Poilievre could become the next prime minister. But especially in elections, anything can happen. From scandals to major news events to strikes, things can shift the terrain. And more importantly, if we don't fight now, our movement will be weaker come election day, and weaker when the next government comes to power. It's what we do now that shapes our ability and strength to fight back against spending cuts, privatization, racist immigration rules, funding for war or genocide, or other harmful or anti-worker policies, regardless of who wins the upcoming elections. So this is why we all need to be seriously considering how to fight Poilievre and the ideas he's putting forward in our unions, in our neighborhoods, or wherever we organize. Okay, so before we jump to Poilievre, and we do want to get into that, his appeal among workers and how to fight it, I just want to share a few learnings from the 2018 and 2022 provincial elections here in Ontario. As Taha mentioned, I'm an organizer in the decent work movement, and the 2018 election, when Ford was elected, was tough because one of the first things he did once he came in power was his government cut and scrapped a lot of the gains we just made, like paid sick days, equal pay for equal work, and raising the minimum wage. But we knew from the organizing that we've been doing that many people who supported our demands had also been considering or planning to vote for Ford. I remember one conversation that I had at Dundas West Station in particular. I talked to a woman, she signed our petition, which was for raising the minimum wage and improving decent work conditions. And then she proceeded to try to convince me that Rob or Doug Ford would never freeze the minimum wage. And she said, they always answer my sister's calls. At another phone bank during the same election time, a volunteer called someone who had the same disbelief about Ford. And during the phone call, the Conservatives canvassed their door. And so he said to the volunteer, stay on the phone with me, I'm gonna ask right now. And during the so on the phone, we listened to them chat, and in fact, the canvasser for the Conservatives confirmed that the Conservatives did not support raising the minimum wage. The supporter was shocked, and I think that was probably, a transformative little moment. Of course, I'm not exactly sure what happened next, but then a couple of years later in Florida, people in Florida voted 60-40 in favor of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In that same election, they also voted for Trump, even though Biden was the presidential candidate that actually supported raising the minimum wage. Okay, now let's jump to 2022. So in 2022, Ford was reelected with a majority. Val mentioned voter turnout was a historic low. But just 5 months later, we were on the verge of a general strike led by education workers. And it was supported by, in that that weekend when we were about to see potentially a general strike, half of Ontarians were saying they would support that, and a vast majority of union members as well. So after introducing Bill 28, which was the bill that imposed the concessionary contract and took away the right, like the concessionary contract on the education workers and stripped away workers' right to strike, the Ford government faced an immediate backlash that united the entire labor movement. And because the education workers had connected their bargaining demands to broader class issues, there had been a broad solidarity campaign coordinated by Justice for Workers. There was also organized parent support. All these things created the conditions for massive and growing public support for the education workers' strike. And many of us know, but I'll just say, the day after the bill passed, workers defied it by going out on a legal strike. Fred Hahn reminded us of this last night. And then just 2 days later, Ford announced he would repeal the bill. There's so much we can learn from that victory, and no doubt it wouldn't have been possible without months and years of organizing by education workers leading up to it, taking action in one conversation at a time, school by school, community by community. But one of the lessons that I wanted to draw from for today's discussion is just that we can't afford to dismiss working people based on who they support, how they vote, or don't vote in elections. In that election, Ford's win at the polls more likely represented the fact that people didn't think voting in the election would lead to the changes they wanted to see. It clearly did not mean there was no appetite to fight Ford's anti-worker agenda. But of course, that sentiment has to be organized in order to actually create a crisis for government. Ford wasn't defeated at the polls, but this experience of all that many of us were part of being on the verge of a general strike does remind us there are other ways to defeat a government's agenda. Okay, so Poilievre, let's skip to the now. So he's got a big lead in the polls. Last week they were sitting at 43%. The Liberals and NDP are trailing behind at 22 and 19. I was gonna ask, has anybody seen Poilievre's recent ad where he's walking in the mountains? But then it got showed at our at the rally last night, so a lot of people have seen it. So I'm gonna skip describing, but I'm gonna say, so it's sort of contrasting his wife walking in the mountains, putting up the Canadian flag, and then you see images of poverty and the kind of in dirty cities. And Poilievre promises to cap spending, axe taxes, reward work, build homes, uphold families, stop crime, secure borders, rearm our forces, restore our freedom, and unite our people around common values. And polls last week actually showed that people liked the ad. 52% of people who watched it felt more positive about Poilievre, and only 14% felt less positive. So why is this message resonating? We are living in an affordability crisis. A lot of people are angry, and they're rightly feeling that they can't get ahead. And I will say, in the beginning of Poilievre's ad, I think importantly, he also does talk about how people can't afford homes or food, and that debt, taxes, and crime are up. I mean, you already tackled the crime piece. Crime's not up, just so you know. But in 2022, inflation did go up by 6.8%, right? That was a massive jump. It slowed since then, but prices are still going up. Wages aren't keeping up. People are hurting. Housing costs in particular have seen some of the most dramatic increases. Ricardo's research has revealed for us that rents in Ontario went up by 55% between 2014 and 2023. That's even though the official allowable increases were only 16.5%. At the same time, corporate profits are up, CEO pay is up, so people are angry. They're looking for someone that will take this crisis seriously and fix it. And Poilievre is saying he will do that. He acknowledges wages are too low, and inflation has been hurting working people. In another campaign video, he says, inflation takes from the have-nots and gives to the have-yachts, explaining that corporations and those with assets do well in an inflationary environment. In another video, he interviews a childcare worker who says her wages are too low to afford groceries and gas. He says he's going to bring down gas and food prices by axing the carbon tax, reforming taxes so workers take home more of their wages, and bringing down inflation by getting rid of Trudeau's wasteful spending. We need to build our confidence to take on these arguments. Government spending did not cause inflation. Pandemic supply chain issues, corporate greed, climate change, and war have caused inflation. Carbon taxes are not an effective tool for addressing climate change, but we can't let the carbon tax distract from the need for action on climate change and the fact that corporations are not paying their fair share. Tax cuts will only make the crisis worse. We need to increase taxes on the 1% to fund the services we all rely on. We can put more money in low-wage workers' pockets by building worker power to raise the minimum wage and bargain for better conditions than by cutting taxes. And we'll be building revenue for funding public services instead of gutting it. When it comes to the housing crisis, a lot of right-wing politicians across the country are offering people a very simple explanation. Too many migrants, not enough homes. In fact, migrants are being scapegoated for other crises too, from healthcare to childcare to education. This not only stokes racism, which divides working people, it also shifts the focus away from government underfunding and policy failures. These racist and xenophobic arguments rely on a premise of scarcity and basic supply and demand. Too many people and not enough doctors, not enough hospitals, not enough childcare spots, not enough schools, or not enough homes. If people accept this scarcity mindset, then Poilievre's promise to build homes is appealing. But we know it's not the solution. Unless we're building non-market housing, building homes is just going to keep fueling developers and landlords' profits, while leaving the rest of us no further ahead. If new units have no rent control, they won't be affordable. And migrants are experiencing the housing crisis, the healthcare crisis, and the affordability crisis alongside the rest of us. But it's even worse for migrants because without access to permanent residency and equal rights, you're not in a position to stand up for your rights in the face of a bad landlord or a bad boss, or even access healthcare or other services. In fact, it's the migrants who are now being blamed for these crises who are doing the essential jobs to keep our economies and communities going. To build our homes, in fact, ironically, or to provide healthcare, provide childcare, grow, prepare, and serve our food. Migrants are also leading the fights to fix these crises. They're taking leadership to build unity and advance the solutions that would benefit the entire working class. Tenants on rent strike with the York Southwestern Tenant Union are majority immigrants. They're leading the fight for fair rent controls without loopholes or above guideline increases. These are the real rent controls that would actually make housing affordable for the whole working class. Migrant workers, including in organizations like the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, the Workers' Action Center, and the Migrant Rights Network, are leading the fight for migrant rights, status for all, and decent working conditions. These are the same workers who were lauded as heroes during the pandemic, but now are being abandoned by a lack of action on a promised regularization program. Meanwhile, more restrictive immigration rules, many of which just came in last week, are being justified as a measure to address the housing crisis. I want to pause on this for a moment. It's like, how did it come to this? Immigration policy that's denying our neighbors equal rights is being presented to us as a solution to the housing crisis. It was less than 3 years ago that Prime Minister Trudeau actually gave the Minister of Immigration a mandate to deliver on a historic regularization program that could provide permanent residency and the equal rights that come with it to hundreds of thousands of undocumented people living in our communities. Leading up to Trudeau making this promise, movements led by migrants and workers in low-wage jobs had changed the conversation. Workers who had been invisible to many people for years were made visible during the pandemic. And it was a fighting movement that did everything they could to keep organizing and reaching new supporters to take advantage of this political opening and make this a reality. In addition, in that moment, to securing this historic promise on regularization, the worker-led movements also made gains on paid sick days across the country. They forced Liberal, NDP, and Conservative governments to take action on that issue. But by manufacturing a crisis about refugees, starting at with the myths about the Roxham Road crossing, with spreading lies about refugee supports and services, and now scapegoating migrants for inadequate and underfunded public services, the right wing really has successfully shifted the terrain. So where the focus had been about equal rights, now it's about scarcity. From considering solutions that raise the floor for everyone, like status for all, like regularization, like paid sick days. Now much of the political discourse is about keeping people out because we don't have enough. We can shift the terrain back, but it's hard work. And there's no shortcuts either. We can't just send emails or make phone calls telling people how to vote in the upcoming elections. We can't just call for strategic voting or electoral reform. We can't just replace the leaders of our political parties with candidates that have more progressive politics. And we can't just dream up a bold platform or come up with the perfect messaging. We need to grow movements. Because for people to see that there's another way to win, we need to build it. We need to expose the contradictions and challenge the racism of right-wing messages and keep talking about who is really responsible for the affordability and housing crisis. That's corporate landlords, big corporations and CEOs, government policy failures, and lack of public investments in services. We need to organize the sentiment of anger towards the 1% and frustration with being left behind by the affordability and housing crisis. That means connecting with people in community groups, in our unions and neighborhoods about the issues and making it easy for them to get involved, to join the movements that are fighting for the solutions that will actually work for workers, like investing in public housing, effective rent controls, raising wages, protections at work, status for all, and equal rights for migrants. And we do need to show people that there's a path to winning these solutions. The best way to do that is to bring our neighbors, bring other people into activity that builds unity and makes gains. Because it really is only through taking action that we realize our power. So bring it back to the upcoming elections. Poilievre and Ford have leads in the polls. But we can't afford to accept that they're going to win. If we don't build a fighting labor movement now, we're paving the way for newly elected governments to implement their anti-worker agendas. Instead, we need to seize this opportunity to organize with people, to unpack the issues that matter most to them, to shift the terrain, to grow our movements, and to build worker power.